From the early 1950s onward, as the global Cold War hardened into rival blocs, a parallel and deeply consequential struggle unfolded within the Middle East itself, a contest later described as the Arab Cold War, in which revolutionary republican regimes led by Gamal Abdel Nasser confronted conservative monarchies led most prominently by Saudi Arabia, not through direct interstate war, but through ideology, influence, coups, and proxy conflicts that reshaped the political landscape of the Arab world, while intersecting with, yet remaining distinct from, superpower rivalry. This intra-Arab confrontation emerged from the post-Second World War collapse of European colonial authority and the uneven pace of state formation across the region, as newly independent societies grappled with questions of legitimacy, sovereignty, and modernity, producing divergent answers that crystallized into two competing models. One embodied by Nasser's Egypt, which promoted Arab nationalism, republicanism, mass mobilization, and state-led modernization, and the other represented by Saudi Arabia and allied monarchies, which emphasize dynastic rule, religious authority, gradualism, and alignment with existing social hierarchies. The roots of this divide lay in Egypt's 1952 Free Officers' coup, which overthrew the monarchy of King Farouk and brought to power a new military-led elite that framed its legitimacy around anti-imperialism and social reform. And as Nasser consolidated authority by the mid-1950s, his vision of pan-Arab unity and resistance to Western dominance resonated across a region marked by economic inequality and political stagnation, threatening the survival of traditional ruling families who perceived his rhetoric not merely as foreign policy posturing, but as an existential challenge to their domestic order. Saudi Arabia, whose legitimacy rested on a fusion of dynastic rule and religious guardianship, viewed Nasserism as inherently subversive, capable of inspiring military officers, urban intellectuals, and labor movements to challenge monarchical authority. And this perception was shared by other conservative regimes in Jordan, Morocco, and the Gulf, which together formed an informal counterweight to the revolutionary camp. The Arab Cold War thus took shape not as a clearly demarcated alliance system, but as a fluid contest of influence, in which radio broadcasts, diplomatic pressure, financial aid, and covert support for sympathetic actors became primary instruments, with Egypt's Voice of the Arabs radio station serving as a powerful vehicle for revolutionary messaging that denounced monarchies as relics of colonialism and urged Arab unity under Republican leadership. The first major flashpoints of this struggle emerged in the mid-1950s as Egypt's assertive foreign policy, including arms purchases from the Eastern Bloc and the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956, elevated Nasser's stature while alarming conservative regimes, who feared both the spread of revolutionary ideology and the destabilizing effects of confrontation with Western powers upon which their security depended. Although the Suez Crisis itself involved direct intervention by Britain, France, and Israel, its aftermath strengthened Nasser's position within the Arab world, as his ability to withstand external pressure enhanced the appeal of his model and intensified the ideological polarization between republicans and monarchists. Saudi Arabia responded not through overt military confrontation, but by leveraging its financial resources and religious networks to counter Nasserist influence, funding allied governments, supporting conservative factions, and promoting an alternative vision of Arab identity rooted in Islamic legitimacy rather than secular nationalism, a strategy that reflected both its internal constraints and its assessment that ideological containment was more effective than direct conflict. This pattern of indirect competition deepened as newly independent states became arenas for rivalry, with Egypt offering political support, military training, and symbolic endorsement to republican movements, while Saudi Arabia and its partners extended economic aid and diplomatic backing to existing regimes, turning local power struggles into nodes within a wider regional contest. The most dramatic escalation of the Arab Cold War occurred in the early 1960s, with the outbreak of civil war in Yemen, where a military coup in 1962 overthrew the ruling imam and proclaimed a republic aligned with Egypt, prompting Nasser to deploy tens of thousands of troops in support of the new regime, while Saudi Arabia backed royalist forces in an effort to prevent the establishment of a revolutionary state on its southern border, transforming Yemen into a prolonged proxy war that consumed Egyptian resources and exposed the limits of revolutionary expansion through military means. The Yemeni conflict illustrated the structural dynamics of the Arab Cold War. As ideology drove intervention, local actors pursued their own agendas, and external support sustained a grinding stalemate, all while the global superpowers observed cautiously, reluctant to escalate but attentive to the implications for regional stability and influence. Beyond Yemen, the rivalry manifested in coups and counter-coups across the Arab world, including shifts in Syria and Iraq, where competing factions aligned themselves rhetorically with either the revolutionary or conservative camp, using external backing to consolidate power internally. And while these struggles were often rooted in domestic grievances, their framing within the Arab Cold War lent them broader significance and intensified their stakes. By the mid-1960s, the cumulative pressures of economic strain, military overreach, and political fragmentation began to erode Egypt's position, even as Nasser's ideological influence remained potent and Saudi Arabia's strategy of patient containment, reinforced by oil revenues and alliances with other monarchies, proved resilient, allowing it to weather the period of revolutionary fervor without fundamental internal disruption. The Arab Cold War thus evolved as a dynamic, multi-layered contest that reshaped governance across the Middle East, producing a polarized regional order in which legitimacy was contested not only between states but within societies. And as the decade progressed, the balance between revolutionary ambition and conservative endurance would be tested by new crises and recalibrations, setting the stage for the later phases of the struggle that unfolded against the backdrop of shifting global and regional power. As the Arab Cold War moved into the mid-1960s, its ideological intensity increasingly collided with material constraints, revealing the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and the practical limits of power, particularly for Egypt, whose ambitious regional posture under Gamal Abdel Nasser was sustained less by economic capacity than by political momentum and symbolic leadership, a disparity that became increasingly evident as the Yemeni proxy war dragged on and drained Egyptian manpower, finances, and morale. By 1965, Cairo had deployed an estimated 50 to 70,000 troops to Yemen, a commitment that exposed Egypt's armed forces to a prolonged counterinsurgency in difficult terrain against royalist fighters, backed materially and logistically by Saudi Arabia. And although the conflict was framed by both sides as a decisive front in the struggle between republicanism and monarchy, it increasingly resembled a stalemate that benefited neither camp while intensifying intra-Arab polarization. Saudi Arabia's approach during this phase remained cautious and indirect, relying on financial transfers, tribal alliances, and cross-border support rather than overt military engagement, a strategy designed to contain revolutionary expansion without provoking escalation that could destabilize the kingdom itself, and this restraint contrasted sharply with Egypt's visible military footprint, reinforcing perceptions among conservative regimes that patience and endurance were more sustainable than ideological crusades. Beyond Yemen, the rivalry permeated regional politics through coups and regime shifts that reflected local power struggles, but were interpreted through the lens of the Arab Cold War, as military officers and political elites aligned themselves with either Cairo's revolutionary model or Riyadh's conservative axis to legitimize their claims to authority, a dynamic evident in the oscillations of power in Syria and Iraq, where competing factions invoked Arab nationalism or traditional legitimacy to mobilize support and secure external backing. Radio propaganda remained a central instrument of this struggle, with Egypt's broadcasts continuing to denounce monarchies and call for Arab unity, while Saudi Arabia countered by promoting religious legitimacy and warning against the instability and repression associated with military rule, a discursive battle that reached millions and contributed to a climate of ideological mobilization that blurred the line between domestic dissent and external subversion. The intersection of the Arab Cold War with the broader Cold War framework became increasingly complex during this period, as the United States and the Soviet Union navigated a region where their interests did not always align neatly with those of their local partners, and while Egypt's relationship with Moscow deepened in the wake of Western estrangement, it remained transactional rather than subordinate, driven by arms supplies and diplomatic support rather than ideological convergence, just as Saudi Arabia's alignment with Washington was shaped by security concerns rather than ideological affinity. This complexity underscored the autonomy of the Arab Cold War as a regional system, one in which local actors exploited superpower rivalry to pursue their own agendas without ceding control over the direction of the conflict. The balance within the Arab Cold War shifted dramatically after 1967, when Egypt's defeat in the June War against Israel shattered the aura of revolutionary invincibility that had sustained Nasser's leadership and undermined the credibility of pan-Arab nationalism as a vehicle for collective empowerment, an outcome that reverberated far beyond the battlefield and altered the ideological terrain of the Middle East. The loss exposed structural weaknesses in Egypt's military and economy, forced a reassessment of priorities, and diminished Cairo's capacity to project influence through force, even as Nasser retained personal authority and symbolic resonance. For Saudi Arabia and other conservative regimes, the 1967 defeat validated their skepticism toward revolutionary adventurism and reinforced the appeal of gradualism and stability, strengthening their hand within the Arab Cold War and enabling them to assert greater influence through financial leverage rather than ideological mobilization. The aftermath of the defeat marked a turning point in which the revolutionary camp entered a phase of retrenchment as Egypt sought to rebuild its armed forces and repair relations within the Arab world, while Saudi Arabia expanded its role as a financial patron, using oil revenues to shape outcomes in neighboring states and to support governments aligned with its interests. This shift did not end the Arab Cold War, but transformed its character, reducing the prominence of overt ideological confrontation, while intensifying competition through economic means and diplomatic maneuvering. The death of Nasser in 1970 further accelerated this transformation, removing the central figure around whom revolutionary Arab nationalism had coalesced, and opening space for a recalibration of Egypt's foreign policy under new leadership, a recalibration that would gradually distance Cairo from its earlier confrontational stance and alter the balance within the regional rivalry. Throughout this period, the Arab Cold War continued to influence internal politics across the Middle East, shaping constitutions, security doctrines, and elite alliances as regimes sought to insulate themselves from ideological contagion or to harness it for domestic consolidation. And in doing so, it embedded patterns of governance and repression that outlived the conflict itself. By the early 1970s, the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia had evolved from a clash of revolutionary fervor and conservative resistance into a more muted contest over leadership and legitimacy within a changing regional order, one increasingly defined by economic power and pragmatic state interests rather than mass mobilization and ideological purity. Yet the legacy of the earlier phase remained visible in the political institutions, security structures, and narratives of authority that had been forged under the pressure of ideological competition, demonstrating how the Arab Cold War functioned not merely as a series of proxy conflicts, but as a formative process that reshaped the internal and external behavior of Middle Eastern states during a critical period of the global Cold War. As the 1970s unfolded, the Arab Cold War entered a phase defined less by revolutionary upheaval than by strategic recalibration, as the ideological polarization that had dominated the previous 2 decades gave way to a more pragmatic competition shaped by leadership change, economic transformation, and the evolving contours of the global Cold War. And nowhere was this shift more consequential than in Egypt, where the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser in September 1970 marked the end of an era in which pan-Arab nationalism had served as both domestic legitimation and regional mobilizing force. His successor, Anwar Sadat, inherited a state burdened by military defeat, economic stagnation, and overextension, and while Sadat initially maintained the rhetoric of Arab unity, his priorities increasingly diverged from those of his predecessor, reflecting a strategic reassessment that recognized the limits of ideological confrontation and the necessity of economic recovery. This reassessment was evident in Egypt's gradual disengagement from Yemen, which concluded with the withdrawal of Egyptian forces and the acceptance of a compromise that effectively acknowledged Saudi Arabia's endurance and the futility of further proxy warfare in that arena. The resolution of the Yemeni conflict symbolized the exhaustion of the Arab Cold War's most militarized phase and signaled a broader regional fatigue with ideological crusades that had delivered instability without decisive gains. Saudi Arabia, for its part, emerged from this period with enhanced confidence and influence, having demonstrated that financial resources, diplomatic patience, and internal cohesion could outlast revolutionary fervor. And as oil, revenues surged following the 1973 oil embargo, the kingdom's capacity to shape regional outcomes expanded dramatically, allowing it to project power through aid, investment, and political patronage rather than overt intervention. This economic leverage altered the balance within the Arab Cold War, shifting the center of gravity away from mass mobilization toward fiscal influence and institutional penetration, and reinforcing a model of leadership rooted in stability and incrementalism. The October 1973 war against Israel, while restoring a measure of Arab confidence and altering regional diplomacy, also underscored the changing nature of intra-Arab rivalry, as Egypt's limited military success served as a prelude to diplomatic engagement rather than renewed ideological confrontation, and Saudi Arabia's role in deploying oil as a strategic instrument highlighted the kingdom's growing ability to influence global and regional politics without direct military involvement. In the aftermath of the war, Egypt's decision to pursue negotiations and eventually realign its foreign policy away from the Soviet Union represented a decisive break with the assumptions that had underpinned the revolutionary phase of the Arab Cold War, signaling that state interests and regime survival now outweighed ideological leadership. This shift culminated in Egypt's gradual rapprochement with the United States and its estrangement from radical Arab states, developments that reconfigured regional alliances and diminished Cairo's role as a pole of revolutionary influence. For Saudi Arabia, Egypt's realignment reduced the ideological threat that Nasserism had once posed and opened space for cooperation on regional stability, even as underlying differences in governance and legitimacy remained. Across the Arab world, the attenuation of ideological confrontation did not eliminate authoritarian practices or political repression, but it altered their justification as regimes increasingly framed control and security in terms of development, sovereignty, and order rather than revolutionary transformation or counter-revolutionary defense. The Arab Cold War thus evolved into a quieter but no less consequential contest over leadership, resources, and influence, one in which coups became less frequent, but political alignments continued to shift under the pressure of economic dependency and strategic calculation. This evolution reflected the broader maturation of Middle Eastern states within the Cold War system, as they navigated superpower rivalry with greater autonomy and sought to insulate themselves from ideological shocks by prioritizing regime durability over transnational mobilization. By the late 1970s, the earlier fervor of the Arab Cold War had receded, but its imprint remained embedded in regional institutions, security doctrines, and elite perceptions, shaping responses to new challenges and reinforcing a preference for stability over experimentation. In this sense, the Arab Cold War did not end abruptly, but faded into a new equilibrium in which the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia was redefined by cooperation and competition within a shared interest in preserving order, illustrating how ideological conflicts of the early Cold War era could be absorbed into more pragmatic state behavior as the international environment evolved. Yet the legacies of the earlier struggle continued to influence political culture and inter-Arab relations, reminding observers that the region's contemporary alignments were forged through decades of internal contestation as much as through external intervention, and underscoring the Arab Cold War's role as a formative chapter in the Middle East's Cold War history. As the late 1970s and early 1980s unfolded, the Arab Cold War entered its terminal phase, not through decisive victory by either camp, but through structural exhaustion and realignment, as the ideological confrontation that had once animated coups, proxy wars, and mass mobilization was increasingly subsumed by the imperatives of state survival, economic management, and shifting global conditions, and the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, once defined by existential opposition, gradually transformed into a pragmatic coexistence shaped by mutual recognition of limits. Egypt's departure from the revolutionary vanguard under Anwar Sadat symbolized this transition, as Cairo's pursuit of economic liberalization and external support required accommodation rather than confrontation, reducing its willingness to act as a sponsor of radical movements and diminishing its role as a catalyst for republican upheaval across the Arab world. This reorientation was reinforced by Egypt's diplomatic isolation following its separate peace with Israel, which temporarily excluded it from Arab collective institutions and further curtailed its capacity to project ideological leadership, leaving Saudi Arabia to assume a more central role in regional diplomacy and economic coordination. The kingdom's ascendancy during this period was not the result of ideological triumph, but of material advantage, as its oil wealth enabled it to exert influence through development assistance, budgetary support, and labor markets, mechanisms that bound neighboring states into networks of dependency and consultation, that favored conservative stability over revolutionary change. This shift altered the mechanics of intra-Arab competition, replacing the earlier emphasis on coups and insurgency with subtler forms of leverage that operated through financial flows and institutional relationships rather than overt political agitation. The attenuation of ideological confrontation did not, however, produce political liberalization, as regimes across the region continued to rely on security apparatuses and centralized authority to manage dissent, practices whose expansion during the Arab Cold War had normalized authoritarian governance as a means of preserving order amid ideological polarization. In this sense, the conflict's legacy was institutional rather than programmatic, shaping how states governed rather than what they sought to achieve. The broader Cold War context also contributed to this evolution, as superpower priorities shifted and the Middle East's role within global strategy became increasingly defined by stability and energy security rather than ideological alignment, encouraging regional actors to moderate confrontational behavior and to integrate their policies into a more predictable international framework. By the early 1980s, the Arab Cold War had effectively dissolved as a distinct ideological struggle, its core antagonists now operating within a shared acceptance of the existing state system and its constraints, even as competition for influence persisted in muted forms. Historically, this denouement underscores how regional ideological conflicts can burn intensely, yet fade without clear resolution, leaving behind altered political landscapes shaped by the strategies adopted in response to perceived existential threats. The Arab Cold War's conclusion thus reflects a broader pattern within the Cold War era, in which ideological fervor gradually gave way to pragmatic accommodation, as the costs of sustained confrontation became apparent, and as states adapted to the realities of endurance within a contested but bounded international order. In retrospect, the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia reshaped the Middle East, not by determining a single dominant model of governance, but by narrowing the range of acceptable political outcomes, privileging regimes capable of maintaining order and alignment over those pursuing transformative agendas, and embedding a preference for stability that would influence regional politics long after the ideological banners of the Arab Cold War had been lowered. As such, the Arab Cold War stands as a critical chapter in the history of the global Cold War, demonstrating how ideological conflict within a region could intersect with, yet remain partially autonomous from, superpower rivalry, and how its resolution emerged not through decisive victory, but through adaptation, exhaustion, and the gradual convergence of state interests under the pressure of time. In assessing the Arab Cold War's final implications, it becomes evident that its significance lay less in any formal conclusion than in the durable structures it produced, as the prolonged rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia reconfigured political behavior across the Middle East in ways that persisted beyond the ideological confrontation itself. And by the early 1980s, the region bore the imprint of decades spent navigating between revolutionary ambition and conservative containment, an imprint visible in the consolidation of authoritarian governance, the elevation of security institutions, and the narrowing of political space across diverse regimes. The repeated use of coups, counter-coups, and proxy conflicts during the conflict's height had normalized military intervention and external sponsorship as tools of domestic politics, encouraging ruling elites to prioritize control over inclusion and to frame dissent as an extension of foreign influence, a habit that proved resistant to reversal even as ideological polarization waned. This normalization was reinforced by the behavior of external powers, both regional and global, whose selective engagement and tolerance of repression signaled that stability and alignment were valued more highly than participatory governance, a message absorbed by local actors and integrated into their calculations of risk and legitimacy. For Egypt, the legacy of its revolutionary phase was a recalibrated national identity that retained elements of Arab leadership and independence, while abandoning the expectation of transformative regional change, a compromise that reflected the lessons of overreach and defeat and that reshaped Cairo's role from ideological vanguard to pragmatic state actor. For Saudi Arabia, the Arab Cold War validated a strategy of endurance and incrementalism, confirming that financial leverage, institutional continuity, and ideological moderation could outlast charismatic mobilization, and enabling the kingdom to position itself as a central broker in regional affairs without assuming the burdens of direct intervention. The interaction of these trajectories produced a regional equilibrium in which overt ideological confrontation receded, but underlying tensions remained managed rather than resolved, contributing to a political culture that favored predictability and risk aversion while suppressing avenues for peaceful change. This equilibrium intersected with the broader end of the Cold War, as the decline of superpower rivalry reduced the external pressures that had amplified regional polarization. Yet, it did not dismantle the internal arrangements forged under those pressures, leaving Middle Eastern states with political systems optimized for survival rather than adaptation. Analytically, the Arab Cold War illustrates how regional ideological struggles can function as accelerants of state formation and consolidation, intensifying internal conflicts that produce stronger security apparatuses and more centralized authority, even as they undermine social cohesion and political legitimacy. Its history also complicates simplistic narratives of superpower dominance, demonstrating that local actors exercised significant agency in shaping outcomes, exploiting global rivalries to pursue regional agendas while maintaining autonomy over the direction and intensity of conflict. As a result, the Arab Cold War stands as a distinct subsystem within the larger Cold War framework, one that operated according to its own logics and timelines, and whose resolution through exhaustion rather than victory underscores the limits of ideological mobilization in the absence of sustainable institutional foundations. In the long view, the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia did not produce a unified Arab order or a decisive ideological settlement, but it did narrow the spectrum of political possibilities, privileging regimes capable of controlling dissent and managing external relationships over those pursuing radical transformation. A narrowing that shaped the region's political development into the post-Cold War era. Thus, the Arab Cold War should be understood not as a failed attempt at unity or a mere backdrop to superpower politics, but as a formative process that reshaped Middle Eastern governance, altered patterns of legitimacy, and left enduring legacies that continued to influence regional dynamics long after the ideological confrontation had faded from view. In its final analytical balance, the Arab Cold War emerges as one of the most consequential yet understated conflicts of the Cold War era, not because it produced a decisive victor or a formal settlement, but because it reshaped the internal logic of Middle Eastern politics in ways that endured long after the ideological confrontation between Egypt and Saudi Arabia had dissipated, and by the early 1980s, the region had been fundamentally altered by decades of rivalry that privileged regime survival, security consolidation, and external alignment over participatory governance and ideological experimentation. The struggle between revolutionary republicanism and conservative monarchy narrowed political outcomes across the Arab world, teaching ruling elites that mass mobilization carried existential risks and that stability, even when enforced through repression, was preferable to the volatility unleashed by ideological confrontation. a lesson reinforced by the experiences of coups, civil wars, and proxy conflicts that had punctuated the Arab Cold War's most intense phases. For Egypt, the arc from revolutionary vanguard to pragmatic state actor reflected the limits of charisma and ideology when confronted with economic constraint and military defeat, producing a foreign policy that traded ideological leadership for sovereignty and stability, while for Saudi Arabia, the same arc validated a strategy rooted in endurance, financial leverage, and institutional continuity, enabling the kingdom to emerge as a central pillar of regional order without assuming the burdens of ideological leadership. This convergence did not signal ideological reconciliation, but rather mutual exhaustion, as both models adapted to the realities imposed by time, cost, and shifting global conditions, producing a regional equilibrium that reduced overt confrontation while entrenching authoritarian governance as the default response to dissent. The broader Cold War context amplified and then attenuated this rivalry, as superpower competition initially magnified its stakes and later receded, leaving behind political systems shaped by decades of operating under ideological threat, systems optimized for control rather than transformation. The Arab Cold War thus illustrates how regional conflicts can operate alongside global rivalries without being reducible to them, driven by local histories, identities, and power struggles that intersect with but do not dissolve into superpower agendas. Its legacy is visible not in borders redrawn or alliances formalized, but in the institutionalization of security states, the marginalization of pluralism, and the persistence of political cultures that equate stability with legitimacy, outcomes that were forged through repeated crises and reinforced by external acceptance. Historically, the conflict stands as a reminder that the Cold War's most enduring effects were often indirect, emerging from the choices made by regional actors navigating ideological pressure, rather than from direct intervention by the superpowers themselves. In this sense, the Arab Cold War did not end so much as it receded, leaving behind a political landscape shaped by its logic and constrained by its lessons, a landscape in which the promise of revolutionary change had been tempered by the realities of governance and the imperatives of survival. Understood in full, the rivalry between Egypt and Saudi Arabia was not merely an episode of ideological competition, but a formative process that defined the boundaries of political life in the modern Middle East, embedding patterns of authority, legitimacy, and control that persisted into the post-Cold War era and beyond, and revealing how the pressures of a divided world could permanently reshape regional orders without ever producing a clear resolution.